podcast. I am your host, Richard Anderson Mann, and joining me, as always, the David Beckham of MMA Radio, John Buhl. How's it going, John?
Yeah, I think you just called me washed up.
Well, I like to think of it as like most of the time you really are dogging it, but every once in a while you do something beautiful.
Oh, okay. Or you could just say I had my glory days and now I'm slumming it on a podcast and trying to bide my time.
As an Arsenal fan, are you scared to death that Man U is just annihilating MLS teams left and right in preseason?
No, not really. I think any top-tier team is going to annihilate MLS teams, but that's a whole other issue to begin with. So.
Shot to the pills of America's premier soccer enterprise. Anyway, big show today. We have number 3 ranked flyweight in the world, Ian McCall. He is going to be taking on Daryl Montague for the Tachi Palace flyweight title August 5th. So that's coming up. We have a full interview with him already in the can. And you and I are going to start things off talking a little Alistair Overeem stuff. Earlier this week, he started talking about how he didn't want to be strong-armed out of the tournament. And the next day, they announced that he was pulled from his fight and being replaced by Olympian Daniel Cormier. What was your initial reaction to the news?
Yeah, I mean, it was weird. I was on vacation for a while, so I came back after about a week of not really looking at anything, and I can't remember. I was about to ask you about something like just look up like some results, and all of a sudden I go to one of the news sites, and that's obviously right there front and center, Overeem out of the Strikeforce tournament. And my first thought was, damn, this tournament sucks now. I don't know about you. I mean, not to say it's not worth watching, but it really lost, I think, a big chunk of its credibility right there, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm obsessed with the former high-level wrestlers, so I'm intrigued by the Cormier fight. However, I mean, he's a very small heavyweight, and Bigfoot Silva, obviously a very big heavyweight. So I think that it's really gonna, I don't know, it might be too much too early, and it might just be too much from a physical standpoint. Also, now that I'm working on the rankings and updating them every week, these are the kind of situations that just like ruin everything because, if Cormier wins, I got to shift everything around, and that's just more work for me. I mean, yeah. Overeem and Silva were both top 10. It was a good fight that people wanted to see. Now it's, it doesn't have the intrigue, and it's more work for me if Cormier wins.
Right. And I don't know. I mean, it's a very strange situation. In some ways, it kind of reminds me a little bit of the Nick Diaz situation as far as, it's different circumstances, but you remember he was talking about, he was willing to go and do a boxing match because that was in his contract and he was able to do it. And you and I were thinking all along, and I think most people thought he was just really trying to get the UFC and Zuffa to maybe do something a little more to his liking as far as his current fighting status. Next thing you know, he's fighting GSP in a really big fight that'll, I'm sure, get a lot of attention. So, while I'm not doubting his injury and, I'm sure his toe doesn't feel good, it's 2 months out and, certainly the first thing that pops in my mind is that this is some kind of negotiating tactic, and the fact that he only has one fight left on his contract, I think, really reinforces that. We're going to lead into this, but if he's kind of basically being pushed out of this, then how much longer does Strikeforce as a viable separate brand really have? Because if it ends up being something crazy cool, like Overeem is just going to go into the UFC now and go there, and they're going to take advantage of what he brings to the table, then Strikeforce has lost another major brand name. Like they've already lost Diaz, and who knows how much longer Melendez is going to be there.
Yeah, so you think Overeem's desire to box is entirely contract posturing?
He's not trying to box, remember?
Yeah, he said he wanted to fight Vitaly Klitschko, man. He wants a step shot at the title.
Oh, well, I kind of took that as a joke. So he's being serious? Oh,
yeah, man. He wants to do it. I don't know. It does sound fairly reminiscent.
I could see him doing some kickboxing stuff if K1 would actually pay him.
The funny thing is, even if he took on Vladimir Klitschko or Vitaly Klitschko in kickboxing, he would probably still lose.
That's true. They both have kickboxing experience. But, and that's the thing, though. As we I'm sure his Strikeforce contract is a lot more lenient than what the type of thing Zuffa would normally hand out. So if he wants to do something crazy like box or kickbox, then it would probably be within his power to do that.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of people were really stressed, and a lot of people thought that it really took a competitive advantage away from the fighters when the UFC bought Strikeforce. And I think now we're seeing that if you have a good manager and you have someone who's shrewd, you can get money that's not available to other people.
Right.
The whole Nick Diaz situation went down because Cesar Gracie is, a tireless guy who works for his fighters. someone like, Dan Miller or Chris Lieben, who the only thing they ever do is call Dana and say, let me fight like right away, they're not going to be getting these opportunities.
No. But on the flip side, let's also remember that there's still a different dynamic right now because both Diaz and Overeem, still have basically what you might want to call a Strikeforce contract. And look what happened with Dan Henderson. And, how much of a different situation would he have been in if he didn't have a Strikeforce to go to kind of get the deal he wanted? Would he have been stuck with the UFC? Would he have had to have sat out for a while like we kind of saw Randy Couture did with his semi-retirement? I mean, and so I think you're right to an extent, and, certain guys are always going to have leverage. A lot of that leverage is starting maybe to go away, and maybe that has to do with the timing of this move. So, he knows he has one fight left on his contract, and he has a lot of flexibility, so now's the time to renegotiate.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to me that the same people who were saying the UFC was a monopoly and fighters didn't have anywhere to go, now when fighters try to make their play, because they're very limited, there's just public outrage about it. People are talking about how Overeem's ducking out of the tournament with this injury and, like, how could he be doing this? There was the whole thing about Lyoto Machida asking for Anderson Silva money. It's like, in a world where UFC is top dog, this is the only way to make money.
Yeah.
Above what they're willing to give you.
And when it all comes down to is that what the fans really want is to see the fights that they want to see, and if that doesn't happen, then they're upset, and that's it.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's smart for the UFC to angle themselves as people who are, we're just trying to put the fights together.
Yeah, I am. But I mean, what do you think though of? Do you think it was Strikeforce's call to try and make him fight in September, or do you think Zuffa or Showtime was in charge of that? I mean, how do you think that played out? Because that's kind of the other curious angle of this. If unless they think he was, dragging his feet on purpose, why try to push this tournament so quickly? I mean, well, I say quick by a few months, but think about how much time we have between the first half of the first round, and suddenly they need to have it happen in September. I'm just wondering how time suddenly became a major factor.
Yeah, I've heard from some sources and from some other media people that part of the reason why they want to do that is because they want to have everything with Showtime go off without a hitch. They don't want to have to negotiate with them about moving events. They want to just get it all over with so that they can roll Strikeforce into the UFC. I think part of it is they just want the tournament to be over with, too. I mean, this is not something that Zuffa has been interested in ever. And I think when it came out, everyone was like, this is not going to work out. And surprisingly, it's actually like gone off with relatively few hitches considering the volatility of it. So I think this is the first real big major hiccup besides Fedor losing. But at the same time, I don't think anyone expected it to go off perfectly.
Well, I mean, then we had the Josh Barnett issue and getting the event in Texas, but I don't know. I mean, at the same time, while I know the UFC isn't in love with tournaments, and we see why with all the things that can go wrong. Really, I thought that the tournament and the hugely positive reaction of just having so many major big name heavyweights in one tournament, I thought that was kind of one reason why maybe the UFC became a little bit more interested in thinking that they might want to buy out Strikeforce, because it seemed like it did really give them a huge momentum boost, at least until it took so long for them to get the second two fights going.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point you bring up.
But now, like you said, they're in this situation where, do we wait and risk causing even bigger damage to the tournament's credibility by having it take forever, or do you just go ahead but then lose Alistair Overeem and you're going to take a hit? You're going to take a hit either way.
Yeah, all right. Hypothetical situation before we move on. Nick Diaz, former Strikeforce champion, now fighting for a UFC title. Let's say they reorganize Overeem's deal and he becomes a UFC fighter. That's two Strikeforce champions who have now just walked away from their titles to go to the UFC. One, how bad do you feel for Gilbert Melendez if he has to fight, after Jorge Masvidal and that kind of guy? Who does he have left to fight in Strikeforce? And two, do you think that eventually there will be tension between Zuffa and Showtime over the dismantling of the Strikeforce product, which wasn't very strong to begin with?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because certainly if and when Diaz and, let's say, hypothetically Overeem, if you lose those two, Melendez, I think it's also a matter of time, because if he wins, like you said, the Masvidal fight, I think that'll be interesting. But if he wins that, then you'd literally be losing money with him by leaving him over there. But
Right.
then the other end of it, like, what would Showtime have to get for them to say, okay, go ahead and dismantle it? So it might be almost like a situation where they would have to buy them out, and would it be worth it? I mean, it would definitely be some intriguing negotiations that would have to go on.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of there's a lot of good fighters still in Strikeforce, but I mean, people are talking about, Tyrone Woodley and Tarek Safdie and fighting for the welterweight title, and that's not even a hint of the cachet that we had with Diaz. And I mean, if that happens to all the divisions, I don't really know what the contracts are like, but I don't see that going over well with Showtime. Anyway, shifting gears, as we mentioned, August 5th, Tachi Palace Fights card going down. Ian McCall taking on Daryl Montague for the Tachi Palace Fights flyweight title. You did an interview with him earlier this week. Let's get a little preview going here.
Yeah, I mean, it was a great interview. I've been lucky enough to talk to him a few times, and you guys can go check out the other interviews with Ian on ProMMANow.com. But it was interesting. He was a WEC fighter, and a pretty talented young kid, but he had some setbacks. I think he went 1-2 with that organization, and talking to him, he felt like he had plenty of talent, but he got in there, got a win in his debut, and he just kind of lost himself and got a little bit ahead of himself and thought, I'm awesome, I can do whatever I want, and just start beating people's asses without trying too hard. And so he had some hiccups, but I think having that setback and getting cut from the WEC, he's really focused now. He's dropped down to 125 and looked great, beating Jussier de Silva, who's was at the time the number one guy in the world, and then he went and beat a pretty tough kid in Dustin Ortiz and just took care of business. And he's looked really sharp at that weight. And he had an opportunity to try out for the Ultimate Fighter, and we talked about that and what happened with that. As you can probably guess from the fact that he's fighting on August 5th, he's not going to be on the show. He explains why and the reasons behind that, and there's a lot of good stuff on there. And also, we talked about the rankings. He's not obsessed with it, but certainly he's number 3 right now, but he did beat the guy who was number 1. So where should he be really? But that'd be something we could talk about, is the flyweight division. There's some great talent right there, but I kind of feel like a little more needs to play out before we have a really good idea of who belongs where, just because so much of the talent's been divided up in Japan, and we've got guys dropping from 135 to 125, and other guys like Daryl Montague, he's a really talented kid and maybe just hasn't had as much exposure. So I think there's a lot for this weight class to really shake out right now, but for the time being, Ian McCall is one of the top dogs, so it was really cool to talk to him, and we went over a lot of different stuff.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point about the flyweight division. I think that there are a lot of it really is a hard thing to judge because there is a split. It was usually always in Shudo and then a little bit going on here with the UWC and everything like that. And now Tachi has really taken the lead on it. And I think we're really going to resolve a lot of these things. Having Mamoru Yamaguchi, who's number 2 in the world, having him under contract. He's going to be fighting Formiga, Jussier de Silva, like you said, on the same card. And I think that, the fact that they've taken the reins is really going to sort that out. The reason why I didn't move McCall up to number 1 is because really, Urushitani was really the best fighter in the flyweight division all along, except that he got submitted by BJ Kojima, so BJ Kojima had the top spot, and then when Formiga beat Kojima, it was a toss-up of who was going to do it. I mean, I think part of the thing is just that he's a new flyweight. And I think that's another interesting thing is when flyweight gets rolling, if the UFC ever does add it, are we going to see a lot of these, bantamweight fighters drop down? I mean, Demetrius Johnson's probably the best flyweight in the world, and he's never fought that low. So.
Well, or Joseph Benavidez, too.
Or Joseph Benavidez, yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, it's the old argument of the linear title versus the longest list of impressive accomplishments, and it's never easy to figure out, too.
Right.
So, I mean, I don't think number 3 is any slight, but, you could make an argument for him being number 1. I mean, part of the argument for him being 1, though, would just be if watching him fight and just seeing how he's looked, but you never know how that'll play out long term.
Right, for sure. I mean, he does look really creepy, and that's always good in the rankings for him.
Yes, he does have great nicknames.
That is good. Anyway, we're going to take a little break. We're going to come back with the interview with Ian McCall, taking on Daryl Montague for the TPF Flyweight Championship on August 5th. Check us out after the break. Look at that.